Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is your host Jamshed Namdar Khan with an episode of the Book Review Now. In this episode, we will explore a magnificent book entitled The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. This book was originally published in 1954 in New York by Simon & Schuster, and a revised edition was published by the Book Foundation in 2014. Muhammad Asad was born as Leopold Weiss on July 2, 1900 in an Austro-Hungarian Jewish family. The book is primarily a biographical sketch. He traces how a European Jew embraced Islam and how he fully integrated within the Muslim community. His story is full of adventure, intrigue, discovery, and success within the Muslim world. Asad's magnum opus, however, will indeed remain his monumental translation of the Holy Quran, entitled The Message of the Quran. In this book, the author traces the story of a European Jew's discovery of Islam and his eventual total embrace of his new adopted faith. He became a Muslim in 1926. In 1952, he served as Pakistan's Minister Plenipotentiary to the United Nations. He lived in Arabia for 6 years, and he became a good friend of King Ibn Saud. After leaving Arabia, he visited India and met the great Muslim poet, philosopher, and father of the Pakistan idea, Muhammad Iqbal. In 1947, the government of Pakistan, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, asked him to head the Department of Islamic Law and Culture. Europeans, following the footsteps of the Greeks and the Romans, believed the European civilization is the pinnacle of the civilization, and this narrow viewpoint has completely distorted the Western perspective. Islam is a particular target of the West, probably because Islamic values are close enough to that of the West so as to pose a significant challenge. The Western conception of Islam and its vehement opposition to it was originally crystallized during the Crusades. In Arabia, he found complete equality between the governors and the governed, and it was quite common for the Bedouins to call the king by his first name. He first met King Abdulaziz ibn Saud in Mecca in early 1927. Asad's wife died in Mecca on his first pilgrimage. In Arabia, he employed Zaid to be his helper, whom he describes as, quote, the handsomest man I've ever known, broad of forehead and slim of body, middle-sized, fine-boned, full of wiry strength, unquote. Upon introduction to an Arabian prince, he bowed, but the prince said, people of Najd do not believe in bowing before man. He should only bow before God in prayer. In Arabia, he married other native ladies, whose love pleased him exceedingly. Asad in his childhood studied Old Testament in the original and could discuss with confidence the differences between the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. Because of his budding religious knowledge, he questioned why the God of the Old Testament and Talmud would preoccupy himself with the destiny of one people only, that is the Hebrews. He could not understand why God, creator of all mankind, would be just concerned with the requirements of one, quote, chosen people, unquote. But at this early age, Asad was not too concerned about the theological and philosophical ideas. What really interested him was what most other boys of his age wanted, which is action, adventure, and excitement. For 2 years after the First World War, between 1914 and 1918, he studied history of art and philosophy at the University of Vienna. But an academic career in formal studies did not quite appeal to his nature. Due to the impact of the First World War, there was a general malaise in the European outlook. All ethical values in Europe became quite amorphous, and there was a spiritual restlessness in the youth. The standards of morality seemed to have vanished. People in Europe started questioning the existence and validity of God, and atheism started taking root in the hearts of the reformers, revolutionaries, and communists. Europeans started putting their faith on science and science alone. People started viewing any ethical, moral codes as a liability. At this time, psychoanalysis was deemed as an intellectual revolution, but this new Freudian science left him without any deep satisfaction. This new science did not appeal to him, as it appeared to be too cocksure and oversimplified. Because of such new ideas, many restraints between the sexes were loosened. Men and women started talking about, quote, the body's freedom, unquote, and as a result, relations had become quite casual, which ultimately led to promiscuity. The early 1920s in Europe were tumultuous years. The general atmosphere there was one of moral and social insecurity. This had given rise to daring experiments in the arts and also revolutionary ideas regarding cultures. But the spiritual emptiness of Europe was quite palpable. The only thought that united Europeans was an urge towards material progress and to make human life independent of nature. The morality was relegated and confined to practical utility alone. But it never occurred to Asad, or for that matter to other Europeans, that an answer to European perplexities and anxieties may perhaps be found in the experiences of other peoples and cultures. Asad came to the conclusion that material progress alone was not the panacea for the ills that afflicted Europe. Human happiness could not be achieved through material progress alone, but it was imperative that material progress be coupled with higher spiritual values and a firm belief in absolute values. However, preaching or intellectual realization of such ideas was not enough to change the spiritual attitude of the European society. Europe was totally engrossed in an egocentric cultural outlook that proclaimed that Europe was the highest civilization and thus superior to all other cultures and ways of life. Therefore, what was needed was a rekindling of the hearts in a new faith, a burning desire for higher values, which did not tolerate just a lip service. But the big question remained where to get such a new faith. Then one day in the spring of 1922, Asad received a letter from his uncle Dorian, who headed a mental hospital in Jerusalem. Dorian was not a Zionist, nor was he drawn toward the Arabs. He was there in Jerusalem just for a job and to make a living. Dorian invited Asad to come to Jerusalem and live with him for a few months. Asad grabbed this opportunity and quit his job in the newspaper agency. Asad takes a ship to Palestine at the next earliest opportunity. On the way to Palestine, he meets a Jesuit padre who was half Polish and half French. Father Felix taught history at a college in Alexandria. Father Felix advises Asad, quote, but the intellect cannot reach spiritual knowledge by itself because it is too much absorbed in the achievements of material goals. It is faith, and faith alone, that can release us from such an absorption. Asad lands in Alexandria, and the same afternoon he takes a train straight towards Palestine. From the train ride, Asad observes the Arab women scooping water into earthenware jars and notes, quote, wonderful women, slender, long-limbed. In their walk they remind me of long-stemmed plants that sway tenderly and yet full of strength in the wind. Young girls and matrons had the same floating walk, unquote. In Jerusalem, Asad was impressed by the simple Palestinian camel and donkey drivers. These simple Arabs had only flat loaves of wheat bread and a little bit of cheese and olives for meals, but their demeanors were as if they were great lords. They had an air of nobility, an ease of bearing and confidence, and a lot of self-respect. Asad was disturbed by how the Arabs prayed with almost mechanical body movements. So he asked the Haji and the Imam why this bowing and kneeling and prostration. The Haji explained that all Muslims, wherever in the world they may be, bow down in the direction of the Kaaba, God's holy temple in Mecca. All Muslims around the world praying towards the Mecca is like a one body with God as the center of attention. First, the Muslims stand upright and recite from the Holy Quran. This recitation is for remembering that Quran is a word of God for mankind and to guide mankind to be upright and steadfast in life. Then they proclaim, quote, God is the greatest, unquote, reminding oneself that no one deserves to be worshipped other than God alone. In Jerusalem, Asad notices that the European Jews seemed quite out of place and harmony in these picturesque Arab surroundings. However, it were these very European Jews, in contrast with the Oriental Jews, who controlled the political life in Jerusalem and were primarily responsible for the disharmony and friction that was beginning to appear between the Jews and the Arabs. The Zionist Jews portrayed in the 1920s as if the country of Palestine was quite empty and only a few Arab nomads lived there. However, the reality was quite otherwise. In 1920, there lived in Palestine nearly 5 Arabs to every Jew. Thus, Palestine was an Arab country to a much higher degree than a country of the Jews. Asad mentioned this fact of Palestine being an Arab country to Mr. Osishkin, chairman of the Zionist Committee of Action, to which he responds, quote, "There is no real Arab movement here against us. That is, no movement with roots in the people. All that you regard as opposition is in reality nothing but the shouting of a few disgruntled agitators. It will collapse of itself within a few months or at most a few years." Unquote. However, Assad disagreed with the Zionist position. The Zionist position was indefensible and amounted to an Arab country being colonized by an exploitative European Zionist entity. In the Balfour Declaration of 1917, Assad drew the conclusion that it was nothing but an old British strategy of divide and rule. The British Zionist strategy of dismembering Palestine was all the more reprehensible as the earlier British had promised the then ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussain, as a price of Arab help against the Turks, that all Arab lands between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf would be reconstituted as one Arab state. But the British broke their solemn pledge to the Arabs under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which gave Lebanon and Syria to France and excluded Palestine from being under the Arab control. Although at the time Assad was himself a Jew, but he had a strong objection to Zionism. He believed the Zionist scheme was immoral, as it was based on a promise of one power, the British Empire, promising the land of another people, the Arabs, and giving it to the European immigrants. These Zionists from Europe were planning to dispossess the native Arabs who had lived there since immemorial times and convert it through force to be a European majority country. Assad met Dr. Chaim Weizmann in Jerusalem, who was visiting Palestine from London on one of his periodic visits there, and asked him what will happen to the Arab majority of Palestine under the Zionist project. Dr. Weizmann responded that Palestine was their country and that they were merely taking back that had been wrongly denied to the Jews. Weizmann also predicted that in a few years' time, Arabs will no longer be a majority in Palestine. Assad wondered how an intelligent and creative people like the Jews viewed the Zionist-Arab conflict in terms of Jewish perspective alone. The Zionists were not inclined to realize that the conflict in Palestine could only be resolved through friendly cooperation with the Arabs and through the Arab consent. Assad thought it very strange that the Jewish people, who themselves had suffered grievously under the European discrimination, were intent on committing aggression against another nation, a nation that was innocent of all Jewish suffering that had happened in the past. This Jewish Zionist aggression against the Arabs made Assad feel extremely sad, as this injustice was being enacted right in front of his eyes. Assad lived in the Middle East from 1922 to 1926. He lived there as a sympathetic outsider and also as a convert to Islam. He witnessed the European political and economic encroachment upon the Middle East. He observed that whenever Arabs and Muslims tried to defend themselves against this European encroachment, the Arabs were invariably labeled as xenophobic. The West does not indulge in any sympathy with the Arabs or Muslims and labels them as politically and economically backward. They interfere in the affairs of the Middle Eastern countries on the pretext of, quote, legitimate, unquote, Western interests. The West does not realize that the many problems facing the Arabs and the Muslims are the direct result of their policies in these countries. Assad traveled to Egypt and found that there was an intrinsic unity within the Muslim world. For example, the call to pray sounded the same wherever he went in the Muslim world. Thus, an inner unity of Islam was much stronger than the artificial and insignificant dividing lines between them. Their conception of morality, their way of thinking, and the prescription of what constituted a good life were almost universally the same or similar. Assad was attracted toward Islam because of its simplicity, directness, and closeness of the people to their God. Because of this awareness, Asad read deeply and extensively about Islam while he was in Damascus. Islam, he found, was a way of life and not really a religion in the strict sense of the word. Islam was a program of personal and social behavior. In Islam, there was no concept of original or inherited sin. There was no intercessors between the man and his God. No asceticism was required. Man alone was responsible for his eternal destiny through what he accomplished or earned during his lifetime. This Islamic creed Asad found to be both intellectually and ethically sound and pleasing. And this was probably the underlying secret reason behind the Arabs' emotional security, balance, and approach to life. While visiting Europe, Asad realizes that he did not feel at home in Europe at all. He seemed to be out of place and a complete stranger in Europe, the land of his birth. The European people looked so ugly to him, with their movements so clumsy and irregular. The Europeans appeared to him to be out of touch with their inner selves. The outward appearances of the Europeans appeared to be quite purposeful, but their inner lives appeared to be quite superficial, shallow, and make-believe. Asad found Europeans to be in search of a new spiritual awakening after they had all but abandoned God. The majority of Europeans wanted to base their trust in reason, rationality, science, and experimentation. Since science was unable to say anything concrete or substantial about God and faith, the Europeans wanted to hitch their wagon to scientific and educational development alone. The Europeans wanted to concentrate all their energies to the development of a material world and intellectual potential. The Europeans did not want to be constrained by any moral, ethical, or transcendental considerations. Although the Europeans did not expressly deny the existence of God, but they simply did not have room for God in their intellectual outlook and systems. It certainly dawned on Asad that just as he had discovered a deep connection between the Arab sense of emotional security based on their religion, the lack of European stability and their chaotic state of ethics was a direct result of the Europeans' loss of contact with their religion and faith and God. Christianity, in Asad's view, had long ceased to provide the moral underpinnings to the European civilization. This lack of faith in God and religion had caused the Europeans to lose their way, especially in the phase of morality, sexuality, and humanity. That is, the lack of faith and vacuum had caused Europeans to fail in how to live a good, moral, and wholesome lives. This lack of faith was the prime reason for the moral decay and failure of the Western civilization. To the Europeans, the outside world is very strange and full of dangers. This fear of the unknown and strangeness of other people prompts a peculiar response in the Europeans. The Europeans underestimate the value of the unfamiliar and are prone to commit violence to it. They want to appropriate the other, take it over by force and violence if necessary, and make it their own on their own terms. Asad feels this violence on the other by the Europeans is quite unnecessary and is a very bad policy for the long run. Asad feels that the cultural distances amongst people can and should be bridged, not by cultural or intellectual rape, but through a deep understanding and through surrendering one's senses to the differences that separate human beings. By understanding those differences that surround the Europeans in this world, perhaps this awareness can kindle in the Europeans their own personal awareness and personal forgotten reality. In Arabia, there has always been a political rivalry between the southern Arabians, who are primarily Najdis, and northern Arabians consisting of people of Hijaz and the tribes of Shamar. The Ibn Saud family, who have been ruling Saudi Arabia for more than a century now, belong to the southern Arabian Najdi family. Apart from political differences between the southern and northern Arabians, there is also a religious difference between the two peoples. It was in the south of Najd, near Riyadh, that a Puritan reformer nearly 200 years ago, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, stirred up the nominally Muslim Najdis to new religious enthusiasm. This puritanical reformation was very rigid and uncompromising and came to be known as Wahhabism. The northern Arabians have half-heartedly accepted the Wahhabi creed, but they are very lax and mild and flexible in their religious outlook compared to the unyielding, rigid, obstinate Wahhabi southern Najdi people. The Wahhabi people consider themselves to be the true representatives of the Islam and consider all other Muslim people as heretics. According to Asad, all the Renaissance movements in modern Islam trace their spiritual impetus from the doctrines of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. These movements include the Ahle Hadith movement in India, the Sunusi movement in North Africa, the work of Jamaluddin al-Afghani, and the movement of Egyptian Muhammad Abdo. But the Najdi development of Wahhab's teaching suffers from two serious flaws and defects. The first defect is the Najdi people confining themselves to narrow-mindedness and eternal vision, which seeks to confine all religious endeavors to a literal interpretation and observation of injunctions, and overlooking the need for penetrating to the underlying spiritual content. The other defect is rooted in the Arab character itself, which is stubbornly zealotic, self-righteous, and does not concede the other to differ. This, according to Asad, is the underlying tragic quality of the Arabs, that they must swing between two opposite poles and they can never find a moderate middle way. One also needs to understand that just barely 2 centuries ago, the Arabs of Najd were farthest from Islam than any other group in the Muslim world. Meanwhile, since the advent of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the Najdis have arrogated to themselves not only the sole championship of the Islamic faith, but its virtual monopoly and ownership as well. Thus, the history of Wahhabi Najd is the history of a religious idea which first proclaimed itself to be a reformation, but soon sank deeply into the lowlands of Pharisaic self-righteousness. This is because all virtues destroy itself as soon as it ceases to be a true longing, true yearning for understanding, and humility and forbearance in the face of differences. Asad relates that his journey to Islam was a slow and imperceptible process and took many years to come to fruition. Asad mentions that when he first came to Egypt and Palestine, he was most impressed by the way the Arabs lived their lives. And when Asad started asking himself questions about the Arabs' thought processes and their belief systems, he was slowly drawn to their religion, Islam. At first, Asad did not believe that the Islamic doctrine was a true word of God, and he did not initially believe that God had ever spoken directly with any man. Asad believed that the holy books that many religions professed were not a word of God, but simply sayings or works of wise men. But Asad's views about Islam and God started changing slowly as he came to know the Arab Muslims and their doctrines. It was while Asad was staying in Damascus that a slow unfolding of Islam in his heart initially started. The more he learned about the Arabs and their religion, more convinced Asad became that Islam was indeed a true religion and that the Quran was indeed the final word of God for mankind. Asad further gained understanding and guidance about Islam from his many visits to the Al-Azhar University in Cairo. At Al-Azhar, he communicated with many outstanding scholars, amongst whom one of the most brilliant scholars was Sheikh Mustafa al-Maraghi. This sheikh was a critical thinker, and he never failed to impress upon Asad regarding the abysmal state of the Muslims of the present time. According to Sheikh al-Maraghi, the Muslims of today have fallen very short of the ideals of their faith, and it would be totally wrong to measure the potentialities of Islam by the yardstick of the present-day Muslim life, thought, and their achievements. Based on the evidence of Muslim decay and stagnation, the West has been at the vanguard of perpetuating wrong ideas for the reasons for this Muslim decay. According to the Western thinkers, the downfall of the Muslims is primarily due to Islam. Unlike Christianity or Judaism, the Muslim ideology is a toxic mixture of desert fanaticism, gross sensuality, superstition, and dumb fatalism. This misguided ideology of Islam, instead of liberating the human spirit, shackles them in obscurantism, misguidance, and darkness. Thus, Islam and its ideas are the primary reason Muslims have stopped in their advancement to modernity and have left them in such abject conditions of decay, destruction, and mortification. Consequently, the sooner Muslims abandon their misguided adherence to Islamic ideology, the sooner they will recover from their decay and join the rest of the world in modernity, development, and progress. However, Asad asserts that his study of Islam and observation of its creed convinces him that the Western world is totally incorrect in its judgment and diagnosis of the causes of the current situation of the Muslim decline. A sincere study of the Quran reveals that it is not a crudely materialistic doctrine Quran promotes an intense God consciousness and strongly advocates rational acceptance of all God-created nature. The Quran harmoniously promotes a side-by-side acceptance of intellectual and sensual urges and fully promotes the fulfillment of spiritual needs and social responsibilities. It was crystal clear for Asad that the decline of the Muslims was not due to their religion Islam, but rather to their own failure to live up to the guidelines and teachings of the great religion of Islam. Asad understood that it was the Islamic faith and religion that had propelled the early Muslims to great heights. Islam had advocated conscious thought as the prerequisite for understanding God's will. Islam did not encourage any rigid dogmas or impossible, convoluted, abstruse intellectual ideas. Islam encouraged logical thinking and encouraged intellectual curiosity and learning. The thirst for knowledge in Islam was not forced, but was a prerequisite in the Islamic faith for a fuller understanding of God's purpose and to understand the nature and world around them. The Prophet Muhammad had advocated acquiring knowledge so mankind could fully understand and comprehend God. Prophet had mentioned that God creates both a disease and its cure. Therefore, it was a duty for both men and women to search for the cures, and this resulted in the great advancement in the medical field that the early Muslims achieved. It was the Muslims who were the first to establish medical hospitals and the learned doctors who served in them. The Muslims were ahead of the Europeans by at least 600 years in the quality and quantity of astronomical observations and data they had acquired through this research and observation efforts. And in a similar fashion, Muslims achieved great heights in other fields of knowledge such as chemistry, physics, physiology, and all other sciences and literature, arts, and engineering. In accomplishing this glorious greatness, the early Muslims were following the guidelines of the Prophet who had stressed that by pursuing knowledge, God will make it easier for them to enter paradise. The Prophet had made it clear that scientists walked in the path of God. The status of the learned and scholars and students were far higher than that of merely pious. Although the blood of the martyrs was sacred, but the ink of the scholars had much greater value and was far more precious. And the history tells us that during the creative period of Islam, which were the 5 centuries after the Prophet's times, Islam had no rival in science, technology, arts, engineering, literature, and learning. Muslim achievements, learning, and pursuit of knowledge was also reflected in the daily social life of the Muslims. Christian Europe was stuck in the quagmire of superstition and dark ages, while Muslims were attaining the pinnacle of their civilization, learning, and achievements. For example, plagues in Europe were considered as scourge from God and were to be meekly submitted to, while the Prophet advocated the Muslims to combat actively the epidemics by segregating the infected areas so the spread of the disease could be stopped. At the time in Europe, the kings and nobles considered bathing as a luxury. There were baths all over the Muslim towns, and even the poorest Muslims in every city could enjoy a daily bath. The bathing was considered almost an article of faith, as cleanliness and ablution was a prime prerequisite for praying. There was no conflict in the Muslim life in enjoying and striving for the beautiful things of this world or for attaining material wealth. Prophet had proclaimed quite clearly that God loves to see his servants obtain a portion of God's magnificent bounty in this earth. Islam was the primary reason for the tremendous achievements that Muslims achieved. These Muslim cultural and scientific achievements constitute, quote, one of the proudest chapters in the history of mankind, unquote. Islam encouraged rational thinking and vehemently opposed obscurantism. Islam encouraged vigorous action versus passivity and quietism. Islam encouraged active social participation versus seclusion or asceticism. It was these positive qualities inculcated by Islam that were the prime reason that people in the non-Arab world were immediately attracted to in the new faith. People in Africa, Asia, and Europe flocked voluntarily in droves to the new faith and converted to Islam without any coercion of the sort. And the sorry state of the Muslim world today is because of the abandonment of the noble ideas and tradition of the great faith that had required them to be active and inquisitive and hardworking in the pursuit of truth and knowledge. Asad vividly remembered his stay in Turkey and his encounter with the whirling dervishes there. This phenomena of the whirling dervishes was quite puzzling for Asad, as their dances and doctrine and esoteric rites did not fit at all with the mainstream Islamic simplicity and guidelines. Therefore, Asad researched thoroughly into this very strange Sufi order of the whirling dervishes. This research proved for Asad and confirmed his instinctive suspicion that esotericism of this kind was not basic to Islam, but had intruded into Islam through non-Islamic sources. These Sufi doctrines had been absorbed through Hindu or Indian influences and ascetic Christian influences. The Sufi practices were totally alien to the message and teachings of the Prophet of Arabia. The Prophet had proclaimed reason as the paramount and fundamental way to understand faith, whereas the Sufi order stressed mystical experiences and emotion as a way to reach faith in God. Islam did not encourage the emotional route to religious perceptions and faith, because emotions are far more liable to be impacted by subjective desires and fears than rational thoughts or intellectual reasoning. Asad narrates the geopolitical intrigues at work in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the fall of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. British imperialism and its vast geopolitical games were at their peak at this time in the Levant, West Asia, and India. Britain had been instrumental in enlisting as their ally the Sharifian dynasty of Mecca, Medina, and the Hijaz against the Ottoman Caliphate. After the Ottoman Caliphate was defeated with the help of the Saudi dynasty of Sharif Hussain bin Ali, Levant was divided between the French and the British through the Sykes-Picot secret accords. Britain, in order to further establish their hegemony and control of the British Mandate region of Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan, were always instigating rebellion and disunity in the Middle East. In the Middle East, tribal rivalries existed, and each tribe considered equal to another in the nobility of their descent and vied for prestige, control, and superiority. This type of tribal reasoning has been a great curse of Arabian history. The disunity amongst the Arabs we see today is the direct result of this type of tribalistic rivalries. No Arab tribe will ever admit that another tribe is better than he. One of the great objectives of the British imperialism in the Middle East in the late 1920s was to secure their land and sea routes to their vast and rich Indian empire. Britain had established the Mandate over the Levant precisely for this great objective. To facilitate this objective, Britain at this time wanted to lay a railway line between Haifa and Basra, in addition to an oil pipeline between Iraq and Haifa. In order to accomplish this feat, Britain needed to gain a land corridor in northern Arabia and wanted to create another independent country between southern Iraq and northern Arabia. Thus Britain instigated a great rebellion against Ibn Saud in 1928 to 1929. This was a culmination of great cunning, intrigue, and planning by Great Britain. According to the Persians, when the Prophet died, the next caliph should have been Ali, as he was not only the Prophet's relative but also his son-in-law. However, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, never in his lifetime nominated anybody to succeed him in the leadership of the Muslim community. By this omission, the Prophet wanted the Muslim community to select and nominate their own leader through a consensus and vote of the entire community. Thus, Ali was only elected as the fourth caliph of Islam after the first three caliphs had gone through their elective leadership roles. Abu Bakr was elected the first caliph by an overwhelming majority of the community, but to the Persian eyes, this was a gross injustice. The Persians believed in bloodline monarchical rule versus republican rule of the rest of the Muslim community. This was the beginning of the great schism in Islam, and the differences thus erupted between the Sunnite and Shiite traditions and remain so to this day. Before Asad accepted Islam at the young age of 26, he had extensively traveled in the Muslim lands and observed minutely the current lamentable conditions of the Muslims. Asad wonders why this abominable descent of the Muslims from a position of a marvelous past glory to the current wretched state of the Muslims. In the library of Medina, he poses this very question to a learned sheikh. The sheikh observes that it was Islam and its magnificent message that had made Muslims great in history. Islam had inspired the hearts of the Muslims and illumined their minds. But soon after, the Muslims forgot why the Almighty had chosen the Muslims for the revolutionary message of Islam. The Muslims have traveled extremely far away from the message that the Prophet had proclaimed and taught more than 13 centuries ago. The downfall of the Muslims can be directly traced back to the Muslims forgetting the sublime message of the Quran and their failures to abide by the guidelines and lessons enshrined in it. Asad dwells on the institution of marriage in the Muslim lands. He wonders why a man is allowed to marry and keep up to 4 wives under special circumstances, but allows only one husband at a time for a woman. Asad discovers and comes to understand that the reason for this dichotomy is really quite simple. Although a spiritual factor of love and emotion plays a role in human sexuality, but the underlying biological factor in the sexual urge is actually procreation. A woman can at one time conceive a child from one man only, and further she has to carry the baby for 9 long months before she can have another child. But the man is so constituted that he can possibly conceive a child almost every time he embraces a woman. Thus, in Asad's estimate, nature would have been quite wasteful in creating a polygamous urge in women. While the polygamous urge in man can be biologically justified from the nature's point of view, in Islam, marriage is not a sacrament but a civil contract. A man is allowed to take a second wife based only on the consent and acceptance of the first wife. If a wife does not agree for the man to marry a second wife, she is free to obtain a divorce and to marry another man. Thus, a recourse to divorce is easily available to either of the marriage partners. There is absolutely no stigma attached to the divorce in a Muslim society. However, in South Asian Muslim society, people hold divorce in utter shame, and this can be traced back to Hindu influences where divorce is utterly forbidden. The women of Islam have been wrongfully relegated and forced in seclusion over the centuries, not because of either Quranic injunctions in this regard or due to any life example that the Prophet provided. The concept of seclusion of women in Islam and Muslim society slowly trickled through the outside influences, especially through the Muslim contact with Byzantium. However, the Islamic message did not consider the spiritual side of human life as distinct from the physical side. The human reality encompasses both the spirit and the flesh at the same time and concurrently, and cannot and must not be divorced from each other. The Islamic faith was an active faith and not a passive one. God is not merely concerned about man's personal beliefs, but also on man's actions, especially those actions that may impact on other human beings. God proclaimed that the strong must not oppress the weak. There was a complete equality between men and women. Muhammad condemned all types of gambling and all types of addictive intoxicants. In the business sphere, Islam banned all profits from interest-bearing loans. Islam did not advocate business monopolies or speculative investments and made hoarding of goods unacceptable. Islam forbade judging right and wrong from the perspective of tribal considerations or national considerations. Muhammad advocated unity of the community based on people's free choice and not based on the accident of common race, origin, or tribalism. In addition, Muhammad strongly advocated to bring the religious teachings of ethics and morality into the sphere of politics. This Islamic idea was a most revolutionary of the time, which stunned the long advocated and stagnant Meccan ideas of religion being a personal matter. The Western civilization has failed to strike a balance between man's spiritual, social, and physical needs. The Western civilization has abandoned its religious ethics without developing an alternative moral system. Despite its advanced educational system, the people of the West easily fall prey to clever demagogues. The West has perfected the techniques of organization, but is unable to prevent worldwide chaos. Because the West lacks the religious orientation, it is unable to benefit morally by the light of its knowledge. The dismal plight of the Muslims affected Asad greatly. He wanted to understand the root causes of Muslim decay and decadence. Asad questioned why the Muslims had lost their self-confidence, which had enabled them to conquer the wide world from Spain to China in less than 100 years. Why were the Muslims of the present age surrendering themselves at the hands of the Westerners so easily? Why can't the Muslim civilization, which was at the peak of achievements during the Middle Ages and had awoken the Europeans during their darkest hours of slumber, not able to awaken itself? How is it possible that the Muslims can venerate a pretender and an impostor like Ataturk and think of him as a symbol of Muslim revival? Asad could not fathom why the Muslims had distorted the clear and simple teachings and beauty of Islam under a morass of sterile hair-splitting entanglements. Vast majority of Muslims were suffering under the unimaginable load of unnecessary poverty and disease, while a handful of rulers were reveling and frolicking in unimaginable wealth. Why were women repressed and not allowed their true equal rights with men? During the times of the Prophet, women were held in high esteem and were at the forefront of all endeavors. It is most unforgiving that most Muslims of today cannot even read or write, whereas the Prophet had declared quite clearly that striving after knowledge was a paramount duty for all Muslims. A learned man was vastly superior in rank and esteem than a pious or religious man. The social scheme that Islam advocated was based on the premise that human beings were biological beings. In order to meet the biological needs, human beings could not live all alone by themselves, but they were interdependent on each other. People had to live in groups and communities. In order to meet the physical, moral, and intellectual needs, people were dependent on each other. This interdependency is the prime reason in Islam why there is no separation between economics and politics. The scheme that Muhammad, peace be upon him, advocated not only addressed the spiritual needs of the humans, but provided a complete framework of how to organize and cater to the spiritual, social, economic, and political needs of the society as a whole. The Islamic law provided the basis of equal benefits and protection of all members of the society, irrespective of distinctions of birth, race, sex, or social or religious allegiance. Islam did not believe in hereditary rule or monarchical rule. The community was to be led by leaders who were duly elected with the consensus of the majority. Thus, the seeds of democracy were incipient in the guidelines and doctrines of Islam. All individuals in the society were to be treated equally without any distinction. All rights and duties were to be applied equally for all members of the community. The loyalty was entirely due to God and one's family and community. Loyalty to tribal affiliation or partisan nationalism was entirely forbidden. Thus, in Islamic civilization, there was no nationalism, no tribalism, no vested interests, no class divisions. Islamic doctrine did not accept any church or priesthood or hereditary nobility or monarchical rule. The idea was to create God-centered domain in the religious sphere and democratic polity in the social and organizational sphere. The community leadership was entirely based on voluntary principles of democracy and consensus. Underlying the constitutional arrangement of social organization was a genuine social contract between the people and the elected leaders. Initially, the great success of the Islamic civilization was due to the great thinkers and leaders of the Muslim world. However, after a few centuries, the Islamic civilization started to decay. The Islamic civilizational stagnation can be traced back to mediocre leadership who could not bring themselves to think for themselves. This leadership could not stem the tide of Muslim decline because they immersed themselves in a morass of intellectual convention, could not extend the great intellectual ideas of the past generations, and could only repeat, parrot-like, the dead phrases of the past generations. Muslims had ceased to think for themselves. Muslims seemed to forget that all human opinions or ideas are time-bound and fallible. All theories and ideas are in need of eternal scrutiny and renewal and reinterpretation in the light of most recent discoveries. Muslims, if they are to come into their own once again, will need to re-examine the old theories and concepts and formulate new ideas and revolutionary new ways of thinking so that they can join once again and contribute to the humanity's march towards eternal progress, development, prosperity, and new cultural heights and achievements. Asad's ultimate destination and object of his innermost desire was really to reach Mecca and perform the Hajj. Both in a spiritual and a metaphysical sense, Asad desired to reach Mecca, the ultimate wish, a destiny to see the holy city and to perform the Hajj at least once in a lifetime for all the Muslims of the world who could afford it. Asad, during his many years of his stay in Arabia, eventually performed the Hajj 5 times in his lifetime. Asad firmly believed that he belonged to the fraternity of Islam, and he celebrated and upheld the universal injunctions of Islam regarding brotherhood, doing good, and believed in its guidelines of ethics, morality, law, economics, and governance. Asad reflects on the fact that in this modern age, the Islamic world and the Western world had become all the closer together. Muslims, under this proximity and impact of the West, are losing their fundamental and foundational beliefs. They're letting themselves go astray. The fundamental idea of Islam is that progress is just a means for greater spiritual perceptions. Muslims have started imitating the West. Just like the West has consigned religion to the background and focused their attention only on progress, the Muslims have fallen into the same trap. By following the Western error, the Muslims are reducing and promoting the failure of their great Islamic civilization. Muslims are encouraged by their Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Quran itself to use reason and seek knowledge wherever it may be found. Thus, there is nothing wrong for the Muslims to learn and acquire knowledge and the scientific methods from the West. This learning from the West cannot be construed as imitation. Science or knowledge can never be construed as either Western or Eastern. Knowledge and science are part and parcel of universal intellectual endeavor. This is the time for the Muslims to learn from the West, just like the West learned from the Muslims in the Middle Ages. It may not be too far-fetched to consider that in this way, the Muslim success and regeneration can perhaps offer to the West once again a path to redemption and recovery and save them from the most self-destructive path that they have become trapped in. Islam has the potential to teach the West the path to the lost secrets of life's sweetness. In summary, this book is a journey of one European Jew's conversion to the Islamic faith. In his own words, quote, "My story is simply the story of a European's discovery of Islam and of his integration within the Muslim community," unquote. The West has a deep antagonism against the Muslim world because the values of Islam pose a tremendous challenge to the values and doctrines of the West. Asad states, quote, "Is it perhaps, I sometimes wonder, because the values of Islam are close enough to those of the West to constitute a potential challenge to many Western concepts of spiritual and social life," unquote. The Western Crusades were a traumatic experience for the Europeans, which has vitiated an understanding and relationship between the two civilizations ever since. Asad states, quote, "The damage caused by the Crusades was not restricted to a clash of weapons. It was first and foremost an intellectual damage, the poisoning of the Western mind against the Muslim world through a deliberate misrepresentation of the teachings and ideals of Islam," unquote. Asad's entrance in the Muslim world was not based primarily on an urge for travel or adventure. The primary urge within Asad was to understand his own inner self, to find a place for himself within this huge world, and to comprehend the diverse world around him. Asad states, quote, "It is this longing for inner discovery that has driven me over the years into a world entirely different, both in its perceptions and its outer forms, from all to which my European birth and upbringing had seemed to destine me," unquote. Asad encountered many customs and traditions in the Arab and Muslim world that the Muslims have adopted as their very own that are completely contrary to the spirit and ethics of Islam. For instance, when Asad tries to take some photographs of the people a Qadi proclaims, quote, "It is shameful to make pictures of living beings, basing it on a wrong interpretation of a saying of the Prophet, for despite the belief, so prevalent among many Muslims to this day, that depicting of living beings is forbidden, Islamic law contains no injunctions to this effect," unquote. Asad admires the simplicity, poise, and character of the Arab people who have never exploited others over the ages. Asad observes these commendable Arab traits in Zaid, his Arab servant and helper. Quote, "These eyes, deep-set and long-lashed, austere and sad in repose, but ever ready to flash in sudden gaiety, speak of 100 generations of life in steppes and freedom, the eyes of a man whose ancestors have never been exploited and have never exploited others. But the most beautiful in him are his movements, serene, aware of their own rhythm, never hurried and never hesitant, a precision and economy that reminds you of the interplay of instruments in a well-ordered symphony orchestra. You see such movements often among the Bedouins, the sparseness of the desert reflected in them," unquote. Asad, since childhood, was a spiritual, moral, and intellectual person who reflected on great themes of human existence, if there was life after death, and what the great thinkers and prophets had taught. Every human being, whether consciously or unconsciously, has always, at one time or another, dwelled on the great abstract ideas of existence, fate, and destiny of a person, and humanity and the world. Asad states, quote, "For whatever the objective truth, to every one of us world manifests itself only in the shape and to the extent of its reflection in our minds, and so each of us can perceive of reality only in conjunction with his own existence. Herein perhaps may be found a valid explanation for man's persistent belief, since the earliest stirrings of his consciousness, in individual survival after death, a belief too deep, too widely spread through all the races and times to be easily dismissed as wishful thinking." Unquote. Further, quote, "It was not the philosophers and the prophets who taught us to believe in life after death. All they did was to give form and spiritual content to an instinctive perception as old as man himself." Unquote. Asad immerses himself fully in the Arab world. He speaks only Arabic now. He wears only Arabic clothes and even dreams his unconscious dreams in the Arabic language. He had absolutely no mental reservations in adopting the customs, traditions, and imageries of his new adopted faith. Asad believed that his adoption of this new faith of Islam and coming to the Middle East was not something strange, but in fact it was coming back to his ancestral roots. He says, quote, "My coming to this land, was it not in truth a homecoming? Homecoming of the heart that has espied its old home backwards over a curve of thousands of years, and now recognizes this sky, my sky, with painful rejoicing." Unquote. Asad in his childhood had studied the Christian and Jewish scriptures thoroughly. However, he soon developed a certain doubt about a faith that was not universal, but focused quite narrowly on the destiny of just one people, the Jewish people, the chosen ones, as they proclaimed themselves. Quote, "It also occurred to me that this God was strangely preoccupied with the destinies of one particular nation, the Hebrews. The very build-up of the Old Testament as a history of the descendants of Abraham tended to make God appear not as the creator and sustainer of all mankind, but rather as a tribal deity adjusting all creation to the requirements of chosen people, rewarding them with conquests if they were righteous, and making them suffer at the hands of non-believers whenever they strayed from the prescribed path." Unquote. This disenchantment with a very parochial tribalistic doctrine was another reason that had propelled Asad to adopt Islam. Europe of the early 20th century was in a social, political, and moral ferment and turmoil. The general atmosphere in Europe in those days was one of insecurity. This insecurity led Europeans to desperate attempts in daring experiments in the arts, music, painting, theatre, and politics. However, in spite of these wonderful, optimistic, and strenuous endeavors, there was a widespread underlying current of spiritual and religious emptiness and of increasing hopelessness. Quote, "The average European, whether Democrat or Communist, manual worker or intellectual, seemed to know only one positive faith, the worship of material progress, the belief that there could be no other goal in life than to make that very life continually easier, or, as the current expression went, independent of nature." Unquote. The Europeans were blinded in the pursuit of power and pleasure, and were prepared to take up arms and initiate wars if anyone got in their way in the pursuit of these objectives. There was no place for morality in the European scheme of things. In these circumstances, it dawned on us that perhaps the solution for the European moral and cultural perplexities may perhaps lie in the cultures, religions, and traditions of some outside civilizations. That is, the solution for the European moral dilemma and ethical problems could probably not be found within Europe's own intellectual traditions, but the solution could probably be found outside of Europe. Asad was most impressed by the simple hospitality of the Arabs. Once, while he was traveling on a train, an Arab broke a piece of cake in half and offered him the other half. The Arab smiled and asked Asad, a complete stranger, to grant him the favor to offer him and share the cake with him. Quote, "When I think of this little occurrence, it seems to me that all my later love for the Arab character must have been influenced by it, for in the gesture of this Bedouin, who over all barriers of strangeness sensed a friend in an accidental travelling companion and broke bread with him, I must already have felt the breath and the step of humanity free of burden." Unquote. Even the poor Arabs had a dignity of character around them. and treated themselves with honor and each other with utmost respect and brotherhood. According to Asad, the common Arab workers, quote, they were poor, ragged men, those camel and donkey drivers, but they behaved like great lords. When they sat together at meals on the ground and ate flat loaves of wheat bread with a little bit of cheese or a few olives, I could not but admire the nobility and ease of their bearing. You could see that they had respect for themselves and the everyday things of their lives. Initially, Asad was perturbed by the way Muslims prayed. It almost seemed to him that the Muslims prayed with almost mechanical movements. Their prostrations, kneeling, bending, and bowing were like soldiers performing some drill. And one day Asad asked a Haji why Muslims can't pray quietly in the stillness of their hearts instead of the repeated physical movements of the body. The Haji responded, quote, how else then should we worship God? Did he not create both soul and body together? And this being so, should man not pray with his body as well as with his soul? It was thus that our Prophet used to pray and taught his followers to pray for all times so that they might willingly surrender themselves to God, which is what Islam means, and so be at peace with him and with their own destiny. Unquote. 1922, Palestine was an overwhelming Arab country, and there were 5 Arabs to every 1 Jew. However, the Zionist propaganda of the day mentioned in passing only that some Arab Bedouins lived in Palestine, and most of these Arabs were just transient nomads. However, the reality was completely different. The truth was that all towns and villages of Palestine were full of Arabs. Because of this Arab majority, Palestine was really an Arab country and could not be considered by any stretch of the imagination being a Jewish country. When Asad mentioned this dichotomy to Mr. Ussishkin, chairman of the Zionist Committee of Action, he responded contemptuously, quote, there is no real Arab movement here against us. That is, no movement with roots in the people. All that you regard as opposition is in reality nothing but the shouting of a few disgruntled agitators. It will collapse of itself within a few months or at most a few years. Unquote. The Arab opposition to the Jewish Zionist colonization of Palestine was thus quite legitimate. Quote, in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised the Jews a national home in Palestine, I saw a cruel political maneuver designed to foster the old principle, common to all colonial powers, of divide and rule. In the case of Palestine, this principle was the more flagrant as in 1916 the British had promised the then ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussain, as a prize for his help against the Turks, an independent Arab state, which was to comprise all countries between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. They not only broke their promise a year later by concluding with France the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, which established the French dominion over Syria and the Lebanon, but also, by implication, excluded Palestine from the obligations they had assumed with regard to the Arabs. Unquote. Thus, from the very beginning, Asad was adamantly opposed to the Zionist project in Palestine and the broader Middle East. Asad raised the Zionist colonization issue with Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the undisputed leader of the Zionist movement. Asad pointed out to Dr. Weizmann that it was not possible to establish a Jewish home in Palestine against an overwhelming majority of Arab population. The Zionist leader just shrugged his shoulders and answered dryly, quote, we expect they won't be in a majority after a few years, but it is our country. We are doing no more than taking back what we have been wrongly deprived of. Unquote. And Asad reflected, quote, how strange that a nation which had suffered so many wrongs in the course of its long and sorrowful diaspora was now, in single-minded pursuit of its own goal, ready to inflict a grievous wrong on another nation, and a nation, too, that was innocent of all that past Jewish suffering. Such a phenomenon, I knew, was not unknown to history, but it made me, nonetheless, very sad to see it enacted before my eyes. Asad wonders how long the Arabs will be able to resist the relentless Western forces that are hammering daily on their doors. The elements of the Western onslaught against Islam comprises of political, social, and economic forces. However, whenever the Arabs try to resist the Western encroachments, the Arabs are labeled as xenophobic. Every Western interference is, quote, sanctimoniously described by its authors as aiming not merely at a protection of legitimate Western interests, but also at securing progress for the indigenous peoples themselves, unquote. The Westerners seem not to realize that this Western interference is the direct cause of the disruptions, backwardness, political exploitations, and misery that the Arab and other Muslim lands are experiencing today. Islam, Asad found, was very different than Christianity. There was no original sin that stood between an individual and his destiny. Islam did not require asceticism for salvation. Man was born pure, and this was his birthright. Islam addressed all issues pertaining to body and the soul. Material prosperity was justified in Islam, and so were human beings' fleshly needs. Islam only required temperance and restraint in achieving these goals, such that the moral consciousness was not impacted adversely. Asad finally came to understand that these Islamic moral and philosophical teachings were, quote, responsible for the emotional security I had so long sensed in the Arabs, unquote. Asad understood that the Najdi Wahhabi movement was primarily responsible for the extreme narrowness of vision, intolerance, and extremism that had slowly crept into the philosophy of Islam. There were two main reasons for this failure. Quote, one of these defects is the narrowness with which it seeks to confine almost all religious endeavors to a literal observation of injunctions, overlooking the need for penetrating to their spiritual content. The other defect is rooted in the Arab character itself, in that zealotic, self-righteous orientation of feeling which concedes to no one the right to differ, an attitude as peculiar to the true Semite as its diametrical opposite, a complete laxity in the matters of faith. The great golden age of Islam was triggered by the Quranic teachings and philosophy and religion of the new faith. Islam had produced great thinkers, theologians, historians, philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians. Islam was pivotal in triggering the Renaissance in Europe and awakening a once slumbering people of Europe. But after a few hundred years of astounding greatness, the followers of Islam lapsed into rigidity, sterility, obscurantism, and imitation. All creative urge and sense of discovery has almost been extinguished in the Muslim world. Quote, those Islamic thinkers whom thou hast mentioned would never have dreamed that after so many centuries their thoughts, instead of being continued and developed, would only be repeated over and over again as if they were ultimate and infallible truths. If there is to be any change for the better, thinking must be encouraged instead of the present thought imitation. This book is a fascinating story of a European Jew's disenchantment with the slow decay of the European civilization and his discovery of the Arab-Muslim world. In becoming a Muslim, Asad analyzes the root causes of Muslim slumber and discovers that the Muslim failure can be pinpointed to their abandonment of the teachings of their faith. It was the Islamic faith that had made the Muslims great and not the other way around. Thus, Muslim recovery and renaissance will require the Muslims to be faithful to their religion and will require the Muslims to give up their narrow and myopic interpretations of the great faith. Until the next episode of the Book Review Now, this is your host, Jamshed Namdar Khan. Salam.